The doorknob was not turning. Ava wiped her sweaty hands down her uniform and took a deep breath. Finally able to wrench it open, she walked into the cavernous space. Hinodes' face glowed in the dazzling light, but she kept her eyes glued to the floor. Her tummy was churning, her breath uneven. A mosaic of his name was underneath her feet. The colours were starting to make her feel sick. A blurring of whites, blues, greens, purples, yellows and reds flashed through her vision as she walked faster over the coloured tiles, not wanting him to raise the walls and trap her within the maze. She shuffled onto the black tiles and breathed a sigh of relief. After years of work, she had finally made it. You took your time. From now on you'll be called 22 and you'll serve Kirigari Hinode. He'll try to make you call him Jin. Do not. He will try to escape you. Do not. He will try to engage you in a conversation. Do not. In fact, do not let him out under any circumstances. Do you understand? Do not. She could not help herself. Her whole world was starting to shatter around her. Why are you still standing there? Go! His words were curt. He did not even seem like he was listening to her. Her head snapped up. She accidentally looked him in the eye. His brow was so prominent. His eyes were shining glints of malice in the middle of two black holes. Mouth so wide, it looked like he could swallow her whole. Teeth gleaming under the kaleidoscope of lights. Jaw so sharp, it had its own shadow. He made her blood run cold. She cowered. His wrinkles were so deep, she felt like she could fall into the scowl that was permanently embedded there. Finally, she averted her gaze, but the damage was done. How dare you, you pitiful leech! Our esteemed master and protector. You appeared beside her and tried to appease him. I apologize on her behalf. Get out! She shuffled out with her head down. Her one chance to get close to Hinode, and she had blown it. What were you thinking? You hissed at her, so quietly she had to strain her ears to hear him. You're smarter than this. He's not going to make you his personal bodyguard. It takes years of hard work and dedication. Most people never make it, but you think you deserve it? Are you insane? Have you lost it? What were you thinking? You weren't. As soon as they were over the threshold, the door slammed shut. The locking mechanism made you flinch, but her body shuddered with a different emotion. Unfiltered rage. She wanted to kick the door until her feet were bruised, wanted to punch Hinode's face until her fists bled. Spare me the lecture, I'm already irritated. Her eyes scanned her new environment. A shiny and polished interior that was lavish, but devoid of life and colour. Go babysit then. Sorry, you. She watched him walk away and sighed. It did not look like there was anyone else around. Her footsteps echoed around the space. It was eerie. She tiptoed forward. A flash of movement drew her eye into the kitchen. The bench was massive, but it was swallowed up by the gigantic room. It was echoing like an empty warehouse. Everything was spotless, gleaming, like no one lived there. A knife glistened under the floodlights. She ran forward, grabbing a chopping board on her way past the bench. As the knife got closer to the stranger's skin, she threw it. Her heart was in her mouth as she watched it fly through the air. It smashed into the man's shin. He stumbled back and yelped. She slid on her knees, scrambling to stop before she hit his bare legs. His dirty blonde hair flew around his face as he shook his head. Strands of it were still dripping wet, like he did not even bother to dry it properly. The blue tips shone under the spotlights and contrasted harshly with the sterile environment. Without thinking, she looked up at him. Shocked, he stared back at her. She blinked, but she could not stop gazing into his eyes. The colours took her breath away. It looked like icy crystals were floating within a gorgeous ocean of blues and greens with a tinge of hazel flecks. They were exploring every inch of her. Suddenly, relief flooded his face. It was almost like he was making sure she was okay. After a moment more of staring, she shook the thought away. Blood started to trickle down his chin. Are you okay? I would be if some imbecile hadn't just thrown a piece of wood at me. He dabbed his lip, pain flashing across his face. Almost bit me tongue off. It's a chopping board. She held up the board with the knife still sticking in it. I thought you'd rather have a sore shin than a hole in your foot. How was I to know you would inflict the damage elsewhere? His eyes narrowed before glistening as if they were turned on by her words. Wait a minute. Are you talking back to me? Yeah, my name's Ava. She looked into his eyes once more. They were puffy and so red, as if he had been crying or was allergic to something. She traced the spider web of red veins that tainted the whites of his eyes. If anything, they made his blue eyes more hypnotic, and she swallowed back the thought. Dangerous. I think your name would be fired the way you're carrying on. He cleared his throat. A small blush was creeping up his slender neck. Her gaze skittered across his exposed skin for a millisecond. He caught her eye and frowned. There was tension in the air, not necessarily uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. A situation they both seemed overwhelmed and entranced by. Oh, it's 2. 22? Right. She gritted her teeth. Her hand was hovering dangerously close to the knife. She took a deep breath. Years of work could be ruined with one irrational impulse. No doubt it would be a satisfying moment, yet she could not bring herself to throw it away for just that. Forcing a smile on her lips, but not able to make it reach her eyes, she looked down, adjusting her gaze in such a way that she did not come across as disrespectful, but did not let him out of her line of sight. He stared at her. Well, I don't do awkward silences, so what do you normally do? Any set routines? She thought she got a glint of intrigue before a cloud of disgust descended. I get another one of you leeches? Why? I can't even leave the house. His mumbled words were laced with malice, as if I want to be here. The resentment caught in her throat. His eyebrow twitched. She shrugged. I empathize. Wow. Aren't you something special? Her lips tightened as she fought the scowl that was threatening to betray her fury. What were you doing? Do I have to explain myself to you now? He limped over to the counter and jumped onto it. Droplets of water flew around him. Some of them were slowly sliding down his pale skin before disappearing into his black t-shirt. Ugh, that's not very hygienic. She scrambled to her feet and watched him place his wet hair onto the spotless counter. Unconsciously, her nose crinkled. Her disgust did not last long as her gaze flitted over his body. Skin so pale, she wondered if he had ever seen the sun, although the stark environment was bright enough to replace it. He squirmed under her intense gaze. Aren't you supposed to have some manners or something? It looked like you were juggling before. She looked away and tried to change the subject. That's not very safe or smart considering what you were trying to juggle. Trying? I was. For what reason? Boredom mostly. He lifted his head and frowned. Why do I have to explain myself to you? You don't! Then why am I? She could not control her rage a second longer. Her thoughts were consumed with the fact that she would probably spend decades looking after another persnickety rascal. All she wanted to do was go back to her family, to the orphanage, anywhere but Hinodes' mansion. She wanted to erase that repulsive family from her memory. They had ruined her entire life, destroyed everyone she had ever loved, warped her sense of self. With misplaced anger, she stormed towards him, slamming the board onto the counter, unsure what she was going to do until she reached him. His body tensed up, but his dopey eyes did not acknowledge her presence. It filled her with rage. She tried to swallow it back, but it felt like lava was trickling down her throat. With all due respect, meaning you're about to disrespect me? Too late. You started that the moment you walked in. The distrust was evident in his voice. She cringed. This was the worst way to start a professional relationship that needed to be built on trust. There was no way to go back and start again. The first impression was ingrained into their minds, and now it would warp every single interaction they had from this point forward. She groaned. Somehow she always managed to make her life harder than it needed to be. I don't want you as my bodyguard. In fact, I want you all to go away. Even if I'm in trouble, I don't need you. I want you to disappear from my sight and never return, no matter what. Don't help me. You don't have the power to fire me. With one sharp tug, she pulled him off the bench. Our esteemed master and protector tasked me with looking after your well-being, whether you need me to or not. I will always help you. whether you want me to or not. I will always be there." He tumbled to the ground, his limbs awkwardly contorting into a weird shape. His face was twisted again, but it looked more like annoyance than pain. He was surprisingly clumsy. She stifled a laugh. "Now I know you're lying. Right now you seem to be the only danger to your well-being." She mumbled under her breath. "I don't know who annoys me more, you or Jay, probably stupid Zara. Anyway, you act as if I'm forcing you to be here, but I don't want to be here any more than you do. A typical Hinode. Do you ever think of anyone other than yourself?" "Jay who?" "Old client." A shiver rippled across Ava's body, exposing her true feelings for a millisecond. Out of everything she had just said, she was surprised that he honed in on the only thing she did not mean to say or want him to hear. "I don't believe you. You don't look like a Hinode." She could not help her gaze floating over him once more. "So why should I care what you believe?" "Fine." He was pinching the bridge of his nose, but he could not control the tumultuous rush of emotions that were flashing across his face. His whole body stiffened. "If you can get him to let me leave this place for 1 hour, then I will let you stay." She smirked and quirked her eyebrow. The floodlights glistened off his devilish grin. "Will that be a problem for you?" A strange emotion flitted across her face. She could feel it distorting into an unfamiliar and painful expression. His smug face was more infuriating than her reaction to it. Her lack of self-control was starting to grate on her last nerve. It had been the day from hell, and now he was rubbing salt into a festering wound, so casually, as if he had nothing better to do. "Do we have a deal?" The only thing on her mind was regret. That she had talked back to Hinode, then looked him in the eye. That she was not good enough for the promotion. That she had foolishly got her hopes up once again. But most of all, that she had not let the knife pierce through Jin's flesh. Her fingertips brushed against the steel handle. There was still time to rectify at least one of her mistakes.